Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar series called the Saying Yes to Digital Projects. For those of you who have not seen the past webinar in this series, let me recap briefly. In our first webinar, we explained how to identify and select your next digital museum project. In our second webinar, we talked about how to fund your next digital museum project. You can access and view both webinars now on our website if you have not already done so. My name is Emmanuel. I'm the moderator for this webinar today. And today we are going to find out 5 museum digitization myths to delete forever. But before we begin, I would like to share what our company is about. Our company's mission is to redefine how knowledge is shared. More specifically, what we do is we work with museums, archives, libraries, and other information professionals like you to provide better access and visibility to your collection. We started focusing on bringing you the best technology and solutions from around the world to create the solution you need. We are comprised of a series of products and companies that have joined Lucidea over the last 30 years. And these brands include Sydney, InMagic, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadra Star. Well, I'm sure you're looking forward to this educational webinar. I would like to let you share a little bit of background of our speaker today, Rachael Cristine Woody. She is the owner of Rachael Cristine Consulting and provides services to museums, libraries, and archives. Her professional experience and expertise has made her a popular speaker on the topic of digital project. She has provided sessions for museums, libraries, archives, and other companies to help them develop their digital perspectives. She has authored several articles on the topic of collections management system, digital projects, digital collections, and other related topics, which have been published on various websites, including Lucidea, I think clearly. She specialized in museum collection management system, digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. And during her course of her career, she has successfully launched multiple digital projects that includes advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and other migration of collection information into collection management system. Without further ado, Rachael Cristine Woody.
Thank you so much, Manuel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and thank you to Lucidea for hosting us. And I am definitely looking forward to digging into our topics today. This particular series was very fun for me to work on because it was able to use things that we often hear quite frequently in our field that can be a little aggravating to hear, and yet don't really have like the ready explanation in our back pocket, so to speak, when we encounter these myths around digitization. So I thought perhaps having a series both in blog post form and webinar form for us to go through these myths. None of them will surprise you, but perhaps the strategies and advice that are contained herein, it is my hope that you'll be able to take those and bring them to either your museum director, your board, donors, whomever it is that may need some gentle education around these particular areas. It's my hope that the content we cover today will be helpful to you in that regard. So to dive right in, then, there are 5 top myths that we come up against quite frequently. The first one is we should digitize all the things. The second myth is that it's easy to digitize museum collections. And then, of course, the opposite partner to that is that it's hard to digitize museum collections. The fourth myth is then the myth of once it's digitized, it's permanent and will live forever. As we know, that is definitely not the case. And finally, the fifth myth is that if it is digital, we can toss the original. So as you can see, from just the top 5 myths we're covering today, we're covering quite a few different areas of hot button issues that we often come up against in our work. I'm then going to wrap it up with some basic collection stewardship practices when we think about digitizing our collections. And then, of course, give you some additional reading if you want to dig into any of these particular areas with the corresponding Lucidea blog posts. Okay, so myth number one, you should digitize all the things. So when we come up against this myth, the person who is usually making this type of statement is coming from a good place. Like they're so excited. They obviously see the value of having museum collection items digitized. So we want to make sure that we're not, that we don't completely shut them down in their excitement. And keeping that in mind, we want to honor the intention. So knowing that like 99% of the time it's coming from a good place, let's start there. And then also engage with that suggestion because it does provide an opportunity for us for that gentle education process to provide that person some of that additional contextual information in terms of what is needed to even go about digitizing all of the museum collections, as well as reasons why we may not want to, whether preservation, copyrights, etc. And when we do have those types of reasons, I have found that just writing it down, even if it's just like a one-page policy that explains how you as the collections manager or whatever your title may be, how you make those determinations, once you write it down into some sort of policy that you can point people to, that will not only help give them the information they need when they come up against that or have those types of questions or suggestions, but it'll help you too, because then you have something that you can point to. You don't have to keep re-explaining yourself. And there's something magical about having it written down as a policy that makes it more official. So in several senses, sort of codifying reasons why digitization for particular items or situations may not make sense will be helpful to you, especially when you come up against myth number one. So here's an example of a mock conversation, and it was written to be very lighthearted and a bit silly, and of course, adjust it to however you think is best with your situation, tone, collections, approach. But it essentially is providing in response to, in this case, a donor, like, I really wish we could. I wish we could digitize all of the things. However, did you know, like, it's really expensive? Like the average cost per item is at least $20. Or did you know that like there's a whole process? And so there's the picking of the item, prepping, scanning, data collection, publishing, and all of that could take like an hour per item kind of thing. So numbers to help quantify, providing the multiple steps that are required from, you can't just like take a photo with your cell phone, like that's not typically how we do it in the museums. So providing that will help. Usually when you do provide that, oftentimes my interpretation is the person's then as overwhelmed as we are when we think about digitizing all of the things. And so just affirming that, like, yeah, it is a lot to think about. It's a lot to consider. And knowing that we have these different things that we have to take account of, depending on who you're talking to, take advantage of that, whether it is a donor, your board, whomever it is that may need and appreciate that additional information and who may be in a position to help you with perhaps some of those resources. Use that opportunity to then ask for what you need, not to digitize all the things, but at least be able to digitize more than you could have previously. And then points for policy inclusion, if you do decide to sort of codify reasons why it may not make sense to digitize. These are some examples of why we don't. So number one, the museum doesn't own the item. If you don't own the item, you really shouldn't be doing anything with it because you don't have any of the permissions or rights to do so. Second one, the item is too fragile to undergo excessive handling and or whatever that digitization process may look like. Third possibility is that depending on what it is that you are digitizing, and this is more common in archives, the actual item may have personally identifiable information. And so that's not something that you want to digitize, let alone have online. And a partner to that is it would be culturally insensitive to digitize the item. So keeping in mind both informational sensitivity, but also cultural sensitivity in terms of why you wouldn't want to just digitize something and put it online that has sacred, personal, cultural reasons as to why that should not be done. Also, perhaps the museum doesn't possess the right kind of equipment to digitize, depending on what it is, to digitize it appropriately. And so until you do have the right equipment, you just can't do it for those particular items. And then, of course, the museum doesn't have either enough staff or staff that are available who are trained or know how to go about the act of both digitization, but all of the parts that are needing to come before and after that act of digitization. So if that is also your case with a small shop, then it's one more reason as to why you need to be more intentional and perhaps more circumspect about what it is you digitize. So, benefits to going and putting some extra effort into dispelling this myth is that it helps to correct expectations, especially if this is donors, board members, executive director level people saying or suggesting this. Then it is in your best interest to make sure that their understanding of what that means and what it takes is correct. Second one is that it creates opportunities for fundraising. Once people realize that you don't have what you need to do something that in their mind they're excited about, they are then motivated to help you figure that out. And in this case, funding is usually something we could all use more of to digitize more things. Also, it helps to advocate for the tools and staff that you need. Oftentimes, it really does come down to there's just not enough resources. So taking advantage of that opportunity and stating what it is that would be helpful and having that sort of ready to go to share with them will help your case and help get you the resources that you need. And then once we do go through things like that and help explain and get people to our cause and increase resources, it helps to strengthen our ability to digitize items right away and to digitize more things. So for all of those reasons, it really does make sense for us to, when we do come up against that type of myth or belief, that we engage with it, because the benefits that come from that engagement really will help us to get even closer to digitizing almost all of the things. Myth number 2, it's easy to digitize museum collections. So when we say easy, there's a couple different meanings people ascribe to it. So sometimes people, when they say it's easy, it's cheap. That it's not that it's easy to do, but it's cheap to do. Sometimes they mean just like time duration. No matter what it costs, if it's fast, then it's easy to do. Or easy from a technical perspective, especially if you have people coming from the assumption of that you can just use your cell phone to take a picture of an item and post it online like everybody does for Instagram, then that is not entirely correct. But you can see why they would think it is easy from a technical perspective to do something like that. So cheap, fast, easy, technically, those are all in the umbrella of it's easy to do. So the cost to consider, so this is if people think that it's cheap to do, these are all of the costs that it takes and the resources that it takes to digitize items, of which I know none of these will surprise you, but again, perhaps this particular slide may be something to take to your boss or board of directors. But you're going to need equipment. So whether that's camera, copy stand, scanner, maybe you're doing audiovisual migration, depending on what type of item it is, you're going to need a different type of equipment to capture it. You're going to need the staff to actually do that work. So the person to capture that digital image or digitize, there's then all of the administrative aspects after that: digital file naming, the file management, creating that metadata for the catalog, publishing online, all of that takes a person, at least one person. And if you are putting it online, you are probably going to be using a collections management system. This is where you put that particular catalog information, as well as assign a digital surrogate or surrogates to it. So you'll probably need some sort of CMS. And then, of course, storage. You need to put these digital files somewhere. And while digital storage is getting cheaper, you are also matching that with how large the files are that we're creating. So we haven't quite reached a place yet where the file sizes are staying stable, but the actual storage space is getting cheaper. We haven't made that yet. We're still sort of raising at the same time, but that's all to say that we need to make sure we actually have a place digitally to where we can store all of the digital files that we'll be creating, and that also costs money. So moving on to the next one, so meaning that it could be like it's fast. Typically that is a misunderstanding of the entire process that we go through as museum workers to digitize something. So for this particular one, we need to walk them through that process of, first of all, select an item. That may sound simple, but it's not. Selecting an item and then preparing it. Then you do the actual image capture, scanning whatever it is for that particular item. You then assign that digital file name and do that administrative logistics we just talked about. You then need to make sure you're putting it in a specific storage location, and hopefully you have like an asset management plan in place to know how to do that and where it should go. Then there's the metadata creation piece, of which there's always going to be some amount of research, referencing the accession file, working with the object itself in order to get additional pieces of data for its record. And then the actual entering, editing, review of that record you've created to go with the digital surrogates that you've captured to then publish it in your CMS and publish online. So there are already multiple steps to this, and if you ascribe times to each of these steps, it can easily take an hour per item to go through all of these. So it is not by any means a fast process. And then to wrap up it's easy to digitize, keeping in mind digitization within museums is a multi-step process, and that there are several sets of industry standards and best practices that we should be referencing and following. Also, digitization requires interaction with multiple different points of equipment and software in order to go through that entire digitization process. And it's not easy. Even if you know how to do it, it's not an easy as in simple process. So it's not in our best interest for people to think that it is easy. They do need to understand the amount of professional work that is involved, as well as the time and the cost. So my recommendation for battling this myth, in addition to having these particular talking points, is to gather the numbers, define subjective words when they enter the conversation, because we could all, like with the term, it's easy. It could mean 3 different things in this case. And then to enter that conversation and provide some gentle education around those particular museum stakeholders. Because again, this usually is coming from a good place, but regardless of the intent of the person believing it, it is again in our best interest to make sure that we're defining, explaining, and really being able to quantify what it takes to do this type of work. So getting into myth 3, it's hard to digitize museum collections. So much like with myth 2, myth 3 can mean a few different things when we talk about it's hard to digitize. It could mean that it's expensive, that it's too expensive to digitize. Perhaps it's too slow, takes too much time, and therefore not worth digitizing, or too hard from a technical perspective. So when we get into this particular myth, the goal is to be sustainable, because while we did articulate that it's not easy by any means to digitize, we also don't want boards of directors, donors, whomever to think that it's too hard and therefore not worth trying. We're hoping to get to some sort of middle ground. So sustainable growth is a good piece to keep in mind as we then articulate these various points. So articulating that we are able to use what we have. So whatever equipment or hardware you already have access to, explain what it is that you can do with what you have currently. Also being able to articulate and just prioritize and slowly acquire the different pieces of whether it's scanning equipment or perhaps different pieces of software that you need, having those prioritized and on a plan for acquisition. Then, of course, considering working with donors and developing grant projects that can assist you in that tool acquisition, as well as helping to support you with that staffing capacity. Because, of course, we can have all of the great scanners and an excellent CMS in place, but if you're still the only person in that department working on it, chances are you have multiple other jobs other than digitizing. And so having that staff capacity piece meet the other resources that you need is key for this. And then in the meantime, research and test those free to low cost tools to help identify what it is are your CMS needs if you don't have a CMS yet, or if you don't have digital file storage in place yet, which if that's you, you're not alone. Many of my clients are still sort of figuring out what does digital storage and asset management look like for them. So getting those pieces figured out, doing some of that research when you have the time, all of this will help you address the "it's just too hard" myth. Then take advantage of the slow parts. So digitizing is a slow process, at least by my subjective definition. And so my recommendations are to try and automate what you can, depending on what type of equipment and software you have. There's a variety of different ways that you can leverage that software to help do automatic scanning, for example, even if it's a cheap overhead scanner. And then get a feel for the rhythm of what it takes to do the imaging and the file processing parts, and learning where those predictable parts of downtime are, even if it's just 30 seconds to a minute. I often have my employees or whomever it is that I am working with in training, I set them up with the tasks that they can perform in tandem. So if they're waiting for a high resolution tray of slides to be scanned, which if you've ever done that, you know, can take several minutes, that in the meantime, they're writing up data for the previous set of slides that they have already scanned. So taking advantage of that downtime and trying to keep the process moving while you're in it. And then, of course, taking advantage of free resources, because digitization can be expensive. So for each new tool, whether it's hardware or software, there are going to be instructional videos, instructional pamphlets, depending on whatever your preferred learning style is, whether it was created by the official equipment company or software company. You're going to find many archive and museum educational sources out there that can help you out and that are freely available. That's one of the benefits of our community, which is the endless consumer made videos part and the how-tos. You won't believe the amount of stuff that is museum archive professional grade from peer museums that are just freely available on YouTube. So start there. Check in with your local and national professional organizations. Sometimes they have ready access to resources or at least guidance on best practices, workflows, process, if those are pieces that you are currently missing and could use help on. And then, of course, also check out Lucidea's additional free resources, both through the webinar suite that Emmanuel mentioned at the beginning, and of course, the Lucidea Think Clearly blog, where not just myself, but many other authors across the museum, library, archive spectrum have written many amazing blog posts that are quick and easy to digest for these types of tips. Myth 4, digital equals permanent. So I wanted to start this particular slide out with, we had such high hopes for digital in the beginning, and wanted to remind everybody of the gold CD, the CD that was marketed as lasting at least 100 years. And while that may be true, the CD itself may very well last 100 years. How many of you have CD drives on your computers anymore? The problem is that the technology has become, like, we've moved on and it's become outdated so quickly. Even if the CD is still good, what are you going to play it on? We could probably still track down a CD drive today, but if you're thinking, 20, 50, 100 years from now, how are you going to access that? Like, it's just the functionality of it lasting 100 years is not going to help us. So that's all to say that, like, we all were really optimistic when that first came out, and now we realize a little bit just like how silly we were. So that's all to say, like, if you're running into this with people who are not used to thinking about our digital preservation issues currently, reminding them of this particular CD's promise as an example as to why we can't feel safe and secure with our technology currently. So just one example of how digital is not permanent. Also, what complicates this is the nature of a lot of software being very proprietary and the challenges of guaranteeing access to things that were created by proprietary software decades from now. It is getting a little bit better, but there is an inherent impermanence to these digital files and to these digital devices that would play these digital mediums like the CD drive. So, in conclusion of this slide, paper still beats technology. I mean, just we still have paper from ancient Egypt, the papyrus scrolls, the organic materials, paper, clay, that would capture information from thousands of years ago are still here. So they still beat technology, at least for now. So don't throw stuff away just because it's digitized, is my point. And if you are interested in more digital preservation tips and strategies, I do want to point out colleague Margot Note. She has a book recently published with Lucidea Press that's Digital Preservation Without Tears, The Archivist's Guide to Digital Preservation. And it's an excellent book, whether you're archives or museums, like it is the same best practices that you should be following. So definitely go and pick that up. And then to continue, the future is promising, especially with the cloud. So many of the data creation products that we are seeing and that are becoming very commonplace now, especially for cloud services. So we're thinking Google Drive, Microsoft Access, Dropbox, etc. They help to facilitate that file syncing and versioning, which are some aspects of digital preservation that we are looking for. So even just like general Silicon Valley produced cloud offerings, while they may not call themselves DAMs or digital asset management systems, they are providing a lot of the same functionality that we're looking for. Also, digital files in the cloud remove one of the main challenges to digital preservation, which is the actual medium. So it's removing that gold CD issue because there's no longer a physical medium we have to worry about accessing. It's now just down to that digital file. Also, files in the cloud mean that they're actually on different servers and several servers at a minimum across the United States and Canada. And some of them even have, as part of their 3 different geographic location minimum, one in an entirely different continent. So for many of them, that tends to be Europe. But either way, you've got multiple copies out there on the cloud. So that does help for any sort of disaster proofing. And it does also eliminate the, no matter what happens locally at your museum, all your stuff is in the cloud and it will be okay. Myth number 5, if it's digital, toss the original. So we did just cover how nothing is going to be permanent, at least not yet. So digitization itself is not a cause, is not a trigger for disposal. This should never be the reason why something gets thrown away. So digital files still pale in comparison to the original. They cannot possibly fully capture the information we receive with our own 5 senses. And for the archivists out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is part of our study. So for the museum folks, there's so much contextual information that can be gained by the physicality of that medium. Also, digital files, as we discussed, are not permanent, at least not yet. So the loss of the digital file, if and when it happens, you still need to have that original to depend on and perhaps rescan at some point in the next century, or whatever that looks like in the next century. Also, the quality of imaging or digitally migrating archival media is improving every day. So a collection that was digitized 10, 20 years ago may warrant and likely warrants updated work. So for example, scanning something at 150 dpi 10, 20 years ago was pretty good. But then we quickly went up to a minimum of 300 DPI. And now for visuals, it's a minimum of 600 DPI to be considered best practice. And as equipment gets better, cheaper, faster, so too, I think will our best practices increase in that quality threshold. So I think there's always going to be a perpetual cycle of redigitizing or imaging our collections, which will be partly driven by best practice, but I think will also be partly driven by digital files and media becoming obsolete. Digitization is a preservation tool, not a replacement tool. So papers that are highly acidic, that are so brittle that they're falling apart, for example, it is an act of preservation to scan that item because it is deteriorating before our eyes. Photographs and negatives where the emulsion is breaking down, gooping, sticking to everything, it's not going to be usable or scannable soon. So getting an image of that now is an act of preservation because it's whether you throw it away or not, it's going to be unusable soon. Items that have been taped, glued, laminated, or otherwise had a substance applied to them and that are actively breaking down, another act of preservation because you need to scan it now. Regardless, it's going away. Also, if the medium is so old or so rare, then it may be difficult to find a device in the future that can access the material. So thinking about those CD issues. So this can be a case for some of your audiovisual materials where you need to digitally migrate your content now as an act of being able to further preserve and access the information. And just in general, any sort of item that is so fragile that they can't be handled or should not be handled often, getting a digital surrogate for that particular item is an act of preservation. So getting back to collection stewardship basics for a moment. When we think about digitizing materials and creating those digital surrogates for the physical items, we have responsibilities still. So responsibilities for the digital collection are the same responsibilities for the physical collection, aka the originals in this particular case. So when we think about how to preserve those digital files, how to provide access to the digital files, what sort of policies around retention and access we may have around those files, how we store them, all the particular nuts and bolts to what it means to store, process, access, preserve digital items, those are all going to mirror, for the most part, how it is you would treat, manage, care for, collect, provide access to your physical collection. So keeping in mind the safeguarding and the integrity of the digital collection items, whether they are born digital and original or copies digital surrogates. So we want to keep in mind best preservation practices. Also using appropriate storage containers for digital storage practices. When it's physical, we know we need to use acid-free, depending on what it is, different materials to store something. The same sort of thought has to go into the digital materials in terms of what's the safest container we can store our digital files in, and where is that, and what does it look like? And then, of course, placing security and access measures around who does have access to those files and can they be accessed safely. This is partially to prevent against human error and accidentally mass deleting or misfiling something, but it's also to prevent anything malicious and people getting a hold of different types of sensitive or otherwise material they should not be seeing or using. So security in a couple regards. So some additional readings for you, because I know we did kind of touch on a couple different areas here. There are, of course, the costs to getting the resources, the staff, the equipment, et cetera, that we need. So I do want to point out the grant workbook and templates that myself and Lucidea have co-created together. And I want to point out that there are 4 project templates in this workbook. One of them is entirely on digitization projects, so go take a look and crib from it. And then it also gets into collection management systems. So figuring out how to pick one, let alone pay for one. There's a great template in there you can use if you are looking at getting some grants to help with this work. And then also how to select, buy, and use a museum CMS if you're one of the organizations out there where either you've never had a CMS and need to pick one for the first time, or if you're in a CMS that's just no longer serving your needs and you need to move into a different one, no matter which camp you're in, this particular book will lead you through the procurement process of how to identify what it is you are even shopping for, let alone getting you and supporting you through the process of selecting the product that will be the best fit for both you and your collections. And then for the Lucidea Think Clearly blog, the most important posts I've listed here in terms of providing some additional information on what we covered. So we have a couple on digitization tools, how to structure and run digital projects. That digitization equation one is a good one to help you think about and figure out how long it takes to digitize and do that whole process per item. I do have a blog post on digitization standards, as well as project workflows and project costs. So there's some numbers out there already that we've worked around and worked on that you can go and use and adapt to your own setting. So in conclusion, for these 5 myths that we covered, it's not that they're entirely untrue. It's just that it's entirely complicated. There are so many things that we as collection professionals have to be thoughtful of when we are doing this work and or planning to engage in this work. And for the people who are asking these questions or having these assumptions or beliefs in these types of myths, whether it is coming through from a good place or not on their part, it is of benefit to us as museum workers to make sure that we are clarifying and correcting the records so that everybody understands just how much thought, professionalism, and resources that have to go into this type of work. And then I think we'll all at least be a little bit better off in having that sort of same frame of reference in terms of how much it takes to do this type of work correctly. And with that, I will turn it back over to Emmanuel.
I really enjoyed this webinar. Thank you for sharing the 5 museum digitization myths to delete forever, Rachel. Rachel has put a lot of time and effort into the material she always share, as you can see. And for this particular webinar, she really dove deep into the 5 myths. I definitely got a lot out of this. She even made one of the myths rhyme so we can remember it. If it's digital, toss the original. That's myth number 5. I will always remember that now. Yeah, she definitely knows what she's talking about. However, here at Lucidea, we do encourage you to ask questions. That's how we can grow and all learn as well. If you have any questions about the 5 myths or any follow-up questions about this webinar, you feel free to reach out to Rachel or Lucidea, and we will pass the word along to her as well. And again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the 5 museum digitization myths to delete forever. Hopefully, you enjoyed this educational webinar as much as I did. And this concludes the 3rd webinar in this series. And if you find this information helpful, we invite you to join us for the next webinar, where we discover the strategies for working with staff, volunteers, or interns on digital projects. As I know a lot of you have or may want to think about these as you work with your coworkers. All right, until next time, and have a good day.